1998 was one of the final years in which cell animation was at the forefront of Japanese anime production. Veritable warriors crammed into their studios, artists would paint each and every frame of animation by hand on transparent celluloid to be played in front of a projector and recorded in front of a static background. And one of the final anime to be produced in this fashion was Cowboy Bebop, seen as perhaps the best anime ever made by many. A cacophony of storytelling, action, and style all brought together into one production that closed out the saga of those animation samurai. Led by the unwavering hand of Shinichiro Watanabe, these men and women carved out what is one of anime's biggest legacies. Watanabe, who had worked in the animation industry for only 8 years, was about to embark on what would come to be appreciated as his magnum opus. Bebop is a series which finds itself at a crossroads of existentialism, maturity, and Bushido, known to most Western audiences as the, quote, way of the warrior. In the 90s, anime was seen by many, especially those outside of Japan, as something made for children. In the first session, Asteroid Blues marked a dramatic shift in what audiences could expect from Watanabe's latest creation. In the episode's opening minutes, Spike meets Laughing Bull, a Native American shaman who tells Spike that he, Swimming Bird, will meet a woman and a red-eyed coyote and death will follow. Chasing down a bounty, Spike meets both Katrina and her husband, the red-eyed coyote himself, Asimov, and quickly ascertains that Katrina is in danger of Asimov's criminal lifestyle. A heavy pursuit begins after Spike confronts Asimov, accompanied by gorgeous animation and a soundtrack that pulls at the heartstrings, characteristics that really would follow us throughout the series. You can feel the swordfish fighting through the gravity and force applied by Spike's turbulent piloting, the worried, focused look in Spike's eyes as he follows his opponent up into the stratosphere, and finally, the shock and dismay that strikes his face as he realizes that Katrina has ended the pursuit herself by killing Asimov. These themes were a shock to anime watchers who had come to expect some level of banality in their viewing. And while Bebop is not without its jokes, they are almost always in the midst of or in expectation of sadness. It is also an example of one of Bushido's most important tenets. Perceiving what is right and not doing it implies lack of courage. It also tells us that once a course is decided, it should be followed without wavering. It is very clear to the viewer that Spike is no longer interested in the bounty on Asimov by this episode's grisly end. He simply wants to save Katrina. There is a cost to just about everything, and Katrina's death obviously weighs on Spike, who is seen having immediately returned to his training in the darkness of space, meditative atop the Bebop. An effort to control future altercations with a more powerful hand. And this scene is a perfect juxtaposition for Spike, as Jet, Spike's partner, arrives with a cigarette in hand and some humor. This humor, and Spike's acceptance of the cigarette during his training, is a lesson in the futility of fighting against destiny. It is ultimately a lesson that Spike is unable to learn and Jet is unable to teach. This is especially true because the two are so different. Spike is serious, gloomy, and frequently apathetic to his crewmates in all but a few instances, and Jet is something of a hedonist in his middle age. He takes care of bonsai trees, gambles, and tries to find humor in, or make light of, inconveniences. And there's a story in Japanese history about powerful warrior Kumagai Naozane, who, so distraught by regrets from the battlefield, renounces his worldly ways, lays down his sword, and follows Buddhism. Jet is a wonderful foil for our main character because he is someone who has been through the toils and troubles of life that Spike, about a decade younger, is experiencing now. At multiple occasions throughout the series, Jet tries to tell Spike that this quest for Julia and the Red Dragon crime syndicate isn't worth it, that he has enough and should be content. Jet is essentially a version of Kumagai, battered by the world but willing to stand by Spike through thick and thin. But every time, his help stops the second Spike chases after Julia, a mission that Jet sees as ill-fated. Both Spike and Jet seem to have their own interpretation of Bushido, or, at the very least, right and wrong. And that is especially true for the next character introduced to the Bebop crew in Episode 3, the honky-tonk woman herself, Faye Valentine. Faye is the purple-haired, sultry vixen that we've come to associate with many popular anime works. In our introduction to the character, she is portrayed as little more than a vagabond out for herself. Someone who would likely be an antagonist for Spike and Jet. When Spike doesn't call her out for cheating at the blackjack table, it's a clear dichotomy between the two characters and their codes of honor. Her eventual joining of the Bebop crew is met with much dismay.
まあ、そうしけた顔しないで、また次に稼ぎましょう。じゃ、私はシャワー浴びてくるから。
また次？稼ぎましょう？おい、ジェット、あいつは何を言ってるんだ？俺に聞くな、俺に。
Though it's undeniable she is a force and a talent that they can make good use of. Her waywardness, and perhaps out of a need to belong and or prove herself, is apparent in Episode 5, Ballad of Fallen Angels. Also, interestingly, the first story-driven episode of the series at that point. It's an episode that really showcases all of the themes we've discussed so far. I think in a lot of ways, viewers questioned what this show was really about until this beautiful montage of visceral violence, narrative cohesion, and sparking revelations. Vicious, Spike's former compatriot, has taken temporary control of the organization they'd both been a member of, the Red Dragon Syndicate. After finding a lead, Spike decides to pursue the bounty of Mao Yenrai, a former capo of the syndicate. He doesn't know it yet, but Yenrai has been dispatched by Vicious. Speaking with Jet before he departs, Spike asks how his older crewmate lost his arm. Jet declines to answer, instead asking him why it matters. When Spike leaves, Jet is obviously upset.
発進する。
スパイク！そう、俺は知らねえからな！
了解。
It's the first time within the series' bounds we see Spike chase his past. Spike meets with Annie, also a former member of the Red Dragon, and unlike Jet, resigns herself to Spike's headstrong spiral into loss and despair.
悪いことは言わない。もうビシャスには関わらない方がいいよ。って言っても無駄だよね。
悪いな。
The unwavering path of Bushido may not be the impetus for Spike's decision-making process, but by choice or destiny, it is Spike's way forward. Were he to ignore the call to answer Vicious and pursue Julia, shame and guilt, attributes that he already grapples with, would be all he ever knows. He is living half a life without Julia. And so, he arrives at the church fully prepared for death. Fully prepared to leave the crew of the Bebop and his newly blossoming friendships behind. Faye has been captured by Vicious and is being held hostage. Her captor tells Spike to drop his gun, but the die is cast. Spike, in total disregard for Faye's life and in resolute accordance with his mission, fires past Faye and into the grunt. A gun battle ensues, and Spike eventually fights himself into a stalemate with Vicious, who says that, quote, the same blood runs through our veins, a reference to their similar personalities and past. They are intertwined. As long as the two live, there will be a moral and ethical dilemma to one another's existence. The battle ends with the two trading blows that are sufficient enough to injure them both and end the conflict. Spike awakes on the Bebop to a watchful Faye, who is performing the first nicety of her stay on the Bebop in caring for him, though her delivery of this warmth is immediately cudgeled by a greater need to indebt Spike to her.
何よ、心配してやったんだから、ありがたく思いなさいよ。
She has grown, yet not enough to put others first, or to be true to herself without the guise of humor. and it is this tango of personalities that weave the web of Bebop's greatest triumphs. One of those triumphs comes in the form of Session 8, Waltz for Venus. Frankly, I think this episode is perhaps the most shocking to the viewer up to this point, at least in the context of an avid anime watcher. The key players are Spike, Rocco, and Rocco's sister, Stella. She has sickness caused by spores that fall from Venus's atmosphere, and Rocco has stolen a gray ash plant that can save her from a group of gangsters. In the episode, Rocco is taught martial arts by Spike, and later, amidst gunfire, playful music, and an approving thumbs up from Spike, Rocco performs the move and is promptly shot from behind. The plant falls to the ground, dashing hopes that his sister can be helped. Rocco spends the entirety of this episode on a mission. In the end, it's Spike who shows up at his sister's doorstep with flowers and the solemn message of Rocco's passing. There's a lesson here, and cliche as it may sound, it may be that no good deed goes unpunished. Spike is, in some way, responsible for Rocco's death, and truthfully, his culpability is not important. He feels it. Like the very first episode, Spike is going to carry that weight. This episode really cements the seriousness with which Cowboy Bebop and Watanabe approach mature themes. And this makes sense, given that Session 9, Jamming with Edward, introduces us to what is the comedic relief of the series, the relationship between the last new crew member, Edward, and Ein, the data dog introduced in Session 2, Stray Dog Strut. Though Bebop is certainly a more grown-up anime, Edward brings a lighthearted atmosphere to the Bebop crew which would have been sorely missed in the long run. It's for this reason that I actually like to point at Edward and Ein as the glue holding these individuals together. What a sad, barren place the Bebop would be without them. That said, there's not a whole lot to note about this session apart from Edward's arrival itself. That's a stark contrast to Session 10, Ganymede Elegy. Up until this episode, we know who Jet is, but we don't know what makes him tick. It's the first time we get to delve into Jet's past in an intimate fashion, meeting one of his former lovers, Eliza. The short of it is that there's a bounty on Eliza's current boyfriend, Rint, and Spike knows about it. Spike chases the couple through an industrial area, almost colliding with Jet, who is unaware of the bounty but has been visiting Eliza. Jet demands that he be the one to chase down Eliza and Rint, which worries Spike. He thinks Jet might let them go. In many ways, this scene is a return to Jet's younger years, both physically and emotionally. Back then, Jet, the black dog, was young, dating Eliza and chasing down criminals as a beat cop. His inability to let things go cost him his arm, a mistake, as we discussed earlier, he tries to help others avoid at every crossroads. And while Jet's decision to capture Rint came after learning about the bounty, the viewer knows well that this isn't about meager money. Spike, submitting to Jet's request, puts it best.
女に未練はないがこの島の蹴りは俺がつける何は節だぜまったく
But after cornering the two lovers, Jet shows that he's a different person now. It's an especially timely moment for this motif to show up as Eliza tells Jet the reason that she left him.
あの頃もそうだった。何でもあなたが決めて、それがいつも正しくて。
While Jet has chosen to capture Rint as his duty compels him to, he shows compassion for them both in his words and lets go of the relationship that's haunted him.
強くなれよそして守ってやんな
This theme driven home by his throwing a watch into the nearby water, a token Jet had held on to ever since their relationship ended. Ganymede Elegy, while somewhat derivative, encompasses what Bebop is about. Love, loss, loneliness, and of course, some great action scenes throughout. Like The Black Dog, it's an episode that doesn't let go of you easily. The next section of Bebop is an arc called Jupiter Jazz. It's a masterwork, carved out of 2 conjoining episodes that boomerangs viewers back to the main story. It's also undoubtedly the most on-flavor and stylish episode of the series, molding beautiful environments, smoky bars, and silver-tongued dialogue into an unbeatable offering from Watanabe and crew. Serving as both the halfway point of the anime and named after one of music's most dynamic genres, it's only fitting that Jupiter Jazz changes the show completely and brings some of our themes full circle. Once again, Spike hears rumor that Julia may be near. Once again, Jet tries to sway him away from running off half-cocked, even making an ultimatum.
戻ってもお前の居場所はないぜ。仕方ないさ。
Faye finds herself again in the midst of Spike and Julia's mess, this time through no fault of her own, unless you count pillaging the Bebop and running to the nearest planet for refuge. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. And while I could hem and haw over why part 1 is so strong, I'll simply point to the scene with Lynn, Vicious, and Spike near its end. Spike is left alive by the 2 in what can only be explained as Vicious's need to kill Spike himself. There's no greater evidence of Watanabe's desire to push the idea of destiny upon the viewer. The 2 are warriors, interlocked in a never-ending battle that only ends with one or both of them dead. Honor, a common word among samurai knights and other servants of the state we've come to romanticize, is tantamount, even to Vicious, a criminal with vast resources at hand. And what a dishonorable kill it might have been if Vicious dispatched Spike so unceremoniously, and only after Lynn rendered Spike unable to defend himself. Even Gren, a character introduced in Jupiter Jazz, feels that he must follow his path in confronting Vicious about his suspicions of being set up. Gren's time with Faye is equivalent to a dead man's walk, and though this theme is usually left to the viewer to ascertain, he even points it out.
なんでビシャスと会うの？あなたビシャスにはめられたんじゃないの？
それを確かめたいんだ。
死ぬわよ。
死ぬのは怖くない。
He knows Vicious will kill him, isn't scared by it, and is instead concerned with how he will live, knowing that he did not take the opportunity to learn the truth or right the wrongs. I think it's this thread that really ties Spike and Gren together, and why the 2 end up having such a fantastic, if short, dialogue near episode's end. The dogfight that ensues after Gren confronts Vicious is without music, warmth, or happiness. It's a bleak spin-out of what remains of Gren and Vicious's friendship, and although Spike does his best to protect Gren, for bounty or for goodness sake, it's not enough to save him. Notice, though, that Spike makes the choice to pursue and help Gren rather than chase Vicious down. This, in many ways, is Spike's rebuttal to the end of part 1. Gren did the dirty work in planting a bomb on Vicious's ship. It would not have been honorable to take Vicious down in such a manner. Spike sends Gren off into space in what is one of Bebop's most acclaimed and mesmerizing moments. The snap of the winch falling off the swordfish as Gren hurtles into space toward Titan, death fast approaching. The haunting but inspiring soundtrack, it's a tearjerker moment, made all the more impactful by Spike's immediate return to the Bebop.
収穫は
ねえよ。さっさと入れ。出発するぞ。
The 2 need one another, though neither will admit it. And frankly, there are probably many of you watching this who have lived this experience with friends or family. And finally, the capstone to the episode, Laughing Bull and his son, who see a star shoot across the sky. Gren's battle is finished, and thus Jupiter Jazz encloses all the circles created at its beginning. An undoubted masterstroke from Watanabe and Sunrise, the studio behind Bebop. Session 15, My Funny Valentine, is an offering that finally tells us who Faye is and why she is such a confusing personality. We come to learn she's revived from a cryogenic slumber in 2068, through which she has accrued a mountain of debt. At least, that's what she's led to believe. In a parallel, Jet and Ed take some fish out of storage only to find that it is frozen and full of poison. Faye has no idea who she is, where she's come from, or where she's going. Between the conmen, lies, deceit, and general nastiness of the individuals which made up the bedrock of Faye's return to the present, It's no wonder to the viewer any longer why she is the wandering Ronin of this story. Faye grapples with the notion of ignorance, an unknown past through which the only truth she may hear comes through the warped mouths of those who had tried to take advantage of her. It is perhaps why she has such a hard time forming real relationships with the Bebop crew, and there is a further dichotomy here between her and Spike, a reason that further suggests the two could not be more different, and why many a fan-written relationship would never work. She has no past, and only the future. Spike has no future and only the past. And if you look at the other three members of the Bebop crew, they are in essence more fun-loving and preservation-oriented. The inseparable Ein and Ed, who simply take in the present and do what they can to find joy in the mundane. And Jet, though solemn at times, has his own hobbies and pursuits that are connected neither to the past or future. Black Dog's Serenade, the next session, is another episode in which Jet's past tries to drag him back. He's one of the only characters who is able to escape the darkness and understands the necessity in doing so. Kumagai, who I genuinely believe Jet is modeled after, will not return to the war of his youth for any other reason than to push it further away. The plot Fad, Jet's former partner, and Udai, an assassin for hire concocted to kill Jet, comes to light. The revelation of how it was Jet's partner and friend who caused the loss of his arm. The story of these three ends with Fad and Udai's death, cleaving another electron from the nucleus of Jet's former life. And like in Ganymede Elegy, rather than blame or hate those who force him to confront his demons, he meets them with compassion. A habit Fad had tried to kick, he asks Jet for a cigarette with his dying breath, noting that destiny, once again, a central theme of Bebop and Watanabe's thematic orchestra. Speak Like a Child is the most insight viewers ever get into Faye's past. It's also a mirror for the relationship Spike and Jet have with her. Constant struggles endured either due to her presence or actions, only to end in an often futile manner. The two scour galaxies trying to find a player for the tape Faye received in the mail at episode's beginning, only to bring the wrong one back to the Bebop. Thankfully, another package arrives with the correct version of the player. The audience, as well as the crew of the Bebop, sit in wonder as a young Faye narrates a time capsule video in which she is happy, outgoing, and hopeful for the future. A stark contrast to the person she has grown to become, a struggle that many deal with in the real world, that unfulfilled potential, not knowing who that younger, ecstatic version of yourself even is. This is really the moment at which Bebop's main story begins to enter the end stages of its life, though we don't return to it until session 24. Before we get to that, I feel like it's important to address the necessity of episodes not discussed in this video. I lump them together because I think nearly all of them share a common thread, the development of your love for the Bebop crew members. Maybe that came in the form of Faye's joining of the Bebop crew in Gateway Shuffle, a disapproving Spike voicing his protest. Perhaps it's watching Ed hack into the Bebop in Session 9, forcing the ship down to the water with a gigantic grin on her face. How can you not love Mushroom Samba, where Ein ingests hallucinogenic mushrooms and begins hopping uncontrollably in what is one of the show's funniest moments? Toys in the Attic, another fan favorite, sees Jet incapacitated by a lobster that has sat in a fridge for years and mutated into a deadly poisonous creature. Or it could be that in Session 22 you fell in love with Spike even more during his contest of machismo with Andy, an Americanized cowboy that is clearly a play on the show's namesake. These scenes, and the episodes in which they are encased, exist to broaden your view, essentially bringing you in as a silent member of the crew. This, in addition to the humor and dynamic storytelling which usually accompanies Bebop's, quote, short story episodes. And so, when the final act starts to seep in throughout Hard Luck Woman, the result is a soul-crushing melodrama wherein the Bebop crew begins to fall apart at the seams. Close to the session's beginning, a story is told that is premonitious in nature. It happens in one scene over the course of just a few seconds, and it's the mark of the end's beginning. Spike stands at the Bebop's edge, brushing his teeth, watching stars fall in the distance over Earth's meteorite-beaten visage. It's one of my favorite moments in Bebop's entire story. But if you remember, Laughing Bull both predicted and noticed Gren's death, also represented by a starfall. Though the very last particles of Bebop's finale have not coalesced quite yet, this moment is a particularly strong example of foreshadowing. And it's hard to notice because it's surrounded by such a strong episode that's almost entirely focused on Faye, Ein, and Ed. Faye has been rewatching the tapes sent to her over and over, trying to find clues of her past, and she's enlisted Ed's technological abilities to assist her. That quest takes them to an orphanage where Ed had spent a few years. Then there's the revelation that Ed's father had come looking for her recently. Ed's father is on Earth with his assistant, McIntyre, mapping new craters made by the meteorites pelting the planet. Ed is unsure of what she wants, and instead of sheltering at the orphanage as the nun offers, decides to help Faye search for information about her past. Over the course of the session, Faye remembers tidbits about her past, many of which come to her during a conversation with her now elderly grade school classmate Sally Young, who she encounters at a landmark from the tape she received. Faye seems shocked when Sally reveals that it was after a space shuttle accident that resulted in her being put into cryostasis. Young wants to tell Faye more, but Faye runs away before any more is revealed. Now, I feel like we've gotten into a lot of summary here, but it's important that we have all these facts in front of us to understand what's happening. Both Ed and Faye have arrived at a similar crossroads, Ed at the orphanage and Faye with Sally, and they've both made the choice to belay the state of knowing, extending their own ignorance to satisfy a need for homeostasis. And even if that way of living is unsettling or unfulfilling, you can see through Faye's mood and actions during the middle portion of the episode that her memories are changing her very quickly. She even apologizes to Spike for running into him and makes the uncharacteristic decision to offer heartfelt advice to Ed.
それが一番いいものなんだから。
Because they mistakenly believe he has a bounty on his head, Spike and Jet briefly tango with Ed's father, who deftly dismantles both of their attacks. The fight is eventually broken up by the Bebop smashing into the shoreline, piloted by Ed via remote control. After giving Spike and Jet chicken eggs as a thank you for taking care of Ed, Ed's father asks if she wants to come with him. But another moment of hesitation strikes, and he and his assistant run off to map yet another crater. These moments are here to show us what a weird, manic, talented guy Ed's father is. In many ways, Ed is the same. And this harkens back to Faye's unsolicited advice that belonging is essential. Ultimately, I think, it's the scene that cements Ed's decision to go find her dad, even if she wasn't ready to make it in the moment. Faye, on a separate mission of her own, lands near a path she recognizes from her memories, which have continued roiling up from the cauldron of her past. The final revelations concerning her accident come to light as she realizes that the path leads to what remains of her former house. By this point, Ed has made her own decision and is exerting her own interpretation of Bushido in leaving the Bebop to walk her path. Ed hands a confused Spike a pinwheel, an action taught to children at the orphanage to mark places they've been. Jet's prepared dinner for the entire crew, but in one of Bebop's saddest moments, notices no one is in the lounge area. Unbeknownst to Spike or Jet, Ed and Ein have both left the confines of the ship forever. Spike and Jet then see that the Bebop's deck is splattered with paint. Bye-bye, written in a style typical of Ed. Faye, laying in the ruins of her home, isn't rushing back to the ship, overcome with emotion and memory. Both Ed and Faye have faced their destiny, their past, and now have a future to each call their own. It is essentially the beginning of their real lives, and a new adventure for Ein. And so, the two who started this journey have no way of knowing if Faye is even coming back. These three crew members that Spike was so adamant against earlier in the series are now the cause of great, if fleeting, sadness for them both. This is evidenced by the voracious eating of the eggs Jet had prepared for the crew, a salve to their unspoken but understood and shared moroseness. And the viewer accompanies them in that sadness, because there's little more bittersweet than watching Faye come to terms with her torturous past or seeing Ed and Ein run off into the literal sunset. And though what may be felt in that moment can be ascertained as negative, it's a triumphant, victorious moment for Faye, Ein, and Ed. They, unlike the falling stars Laughing Bull so often points us to, were able to escape their orbital paths and live full lives. The way forward is no longer clouded by confusion or doubt on the purgatory-like Bebop ship. And so, the final 2-episode arc begins. Sessions 25 and 26, appropriately titled The Real Folk Blues. The dreary, solemn essence of this masterstroke is testament to Shinichiro Watanabe's storytelling ability, a true moment of magnificence in a TV genre that's so often ridiculed for its inability to be serious and own it. In the episode, Spike receives his first concrete, unabated lead as to where Julia is. Jet, given one last opportunity to stop Spike, no longer beats around the bush. After telling Spike a story that we can only assume is based on the Ernest Hemingway short story, Snows of Kilimanjaro, Jet explains they hate stories like that. Stories where men look back on their lives and wonder if they'd lived only as they are dying. Spike rebuts Jet's words with what may be the most honest in the entirety of Bebop.
あいつさ、俺が亡くした俺の片割れさ、俺が欲しかった、俺のかけらなんだ。
Faye returns to the ship, giving Spike the direct location of Julia, who she met earlier in the episode, and Red Dragon members attack. She explains that they are trying to kill her, and Spike immediately takes off to defend the Bebop and its crew. Spike's tacit determination is on display throughout the scene, piloting his swordfish with intensity we'd not seen from his character ever before. Interspersed throughout is the revelation that Vicious is performing a coup of the Red Dragon Syndicate, on its own a display of vengeance and blood spatter. All the while, the throbbing pulse of Bebop's lifeblood, its music, ripping the viewer into a greater understanding of the love Spike has for Julia. Jet and Faye come to this realization along with the viewer. Jet, having lost his arm, Eliza, former partners, all demons that he has had to tangle with throughout the series. And although he has conquered these things, they are also part of his history, which forced him to carry resentment, shame, and regret for many years. Now, knowing that without Julia he can never be whole, it only makes sense that Jet finally tells Spike to chase Julia.
Spike, まだ止めるか。
こっちはもういい。行け。なくしたもんとやらを掴んでこい。
Spike, surprised as the viewer and Faye, veers off to go find Julia, and the episode ends with their meeting, bringing us to the second half of The Real Folk Blues. Julia is killed early in the episode, a moment which seals the fate for our main character. And honestly, while I wish there was more to say about Julia as a character, she is really a sacrificial lamb upon which Bebop is able to throw its deep-seated themes and motifs. Returning to the Bebop, Jet feeds Spike and the two trade jabs as they'd done in Session 1, a sort of return to the beginning.
あんたの作る飯はまずいな。その割に随分食ってるだろうが。空腹は最高の調味料ってやつさ。
Spike's death looms, and Laughing Bull's words from Session 1 begin to look oddly applicable 25 episodes later. Spike regales Jet with his own story about a tiger-striped cat who has lived many lives of unhappiness before meeting another cat which makes him happy. The other cat dies, and so too does the tiger-striped cat. Spike deflects the seriousness of this story, and really it's a layout for what he plans to do, and the two share in what is the series' only moment of true laughter.
いい話だ。俺はこの話が嫌いだ。俺は猫が嫌いだ。
Jet has accepted what Spike plans, only asking one thing.
一つだけ聞いていいか。なんだ。女のためか。死んだ女のためにできることなんてないさ。
Faye meets Spike before he's able to leave, and the theme we've poked and prodded at comes to a head. Faye cannot understand where Spike is because she has not lived his experience.
その時から俺は片方の目で過去を見て、もう一方で今を見てた。目に見えてるもんだけが現実じゃない。そう思ってた。
Her future, bright and full of hope and promise, juxtaposed against the despair and tragedy of living without that which makes you whole. And though he is not shown, Jet sits quietly in the other room, never intervening, his acceptance of the situation now full and strong. Earlier in the episode, Laughing Bull spoke with Jet.
死はいつもそばにいる。恐れを見せた途端、それは光よりも早く飛びかかってくるだろう。恐れなければ、それはただ優しく。
And I think this is really important to use as a lens when looking back at all the sessions as a whole, or even on a rewatch. Spike has lived all of these adventures, never fearing death because he's never been fully alive. He seems to relish in conflict, even when it brings him close to death, realizing time and time again that others pay the price for his headstrongness, Julia included. And so his reason for living dead, he chooses to begin what you could call a dead man's walk, which we alluded to earlier with Gren.
死にに行くわけじゃない。俺が本当に生きてるかどうか確かめに行くんだ。
This device has been used in media of many different forms for hundreds of years. It is, in essence, a performative and change-making harakiri, the ritualistic suicide of oneself in the pursuit of allegorical meaning or idealism.
We ain't both gonna make it. Go. Now. I'll hold them up. It would mean a lot to me. Please.
It is a theme in direct concordance with the tenets of Bushido, which tells its followers they should not fear death, but rather welcome it when the time is right. In Spike's eyes, at odds with one another, the present and past have made their edict. Spike, knowing that he is stepping to his death, flies his swordfish away from the Bebop, where Jet is seen for the last time cleaning the deck of the ship. Faye has not moved from the hall she last met Spike in, crying. It's the last time we see her as well, this scene dragging us with Spike on his forlorn mission. As Spike walks across the Red Dragon Syndicate's logo, it signifies a return to his former life. No more running, no more waiting. Spike kicks a grenade into the lobby and begins his final mission. Clean animation, wonderfully paced action, and the series' best piece of music accompany Spike on this journey to the building's top, where Vicious lies in wait. Along the climb, Spike is saved by Shin, who had previously shown an unwarranted allegiance to Vicious. In the process, Shin loses his life, telling Spike his hopes. Eventually, Spike finds Vicious, and the two face off, the only appropriate ending being the end of both their lives. Their own weapons utilized to take one another down. Two destinies intertwined in blood, love, and tears, both caught in the horror of the past and ill-fated futures. Spike has found out he's alive, but only just before dying on the steps below a blue sky, a rarity in the Bebop universe. And this is the sadness of Cowboy Bebop. Moment after moment of life or happiness, each met with a gut punch that strikes deep down into the core. If you live long enough to survive those punches, you end up like a regret-filled Jet. If you run away from them for long enough, your life becomes a toxic pit like Faye's. If you can see the warning signs of this life early enough, you can escape, like Ed and Ein. And sometimes, it's inescapable. The punches are too much to bear, and so you end up like Spike. Watanabe's masterwork showed that anime didn't have to meet its themes with banality. It showed that older, more mature characters could be the driving force behind storytelling. Bebop has influenced hundreds of anime that came after it, including Watanabe's own work. The dynamic attitude of Bebop will outlive most of what surrounds it, if not everything, in the world of anime. And well, we're gonna have to carry that weight.